Great segue to turning it to Caren, who's going to bridge the two parts of the session by talking about the World Bank role in closing the gender gap and some of the programs and initiatives. WeMena is one, but there are plenty of others, and how can we continue to grow that space in support of the gender agenda?
I'd like to thank Ayat and colleagues for organizing the panel, and thanks to my distinguished panelists. I'm really happy that I'm in a room that has as many men here as women, because this is your issue. It's not just a women's issue, as Hafez said. It's all of our issues. And so I'm really happy when I see men at the table. I'm going to do exactly what Ayat suggested, which is to talk a little bit about what the bank is doing, but I'm really pleased to follow Yara and Sundus in their comments, because I think what they said very nicely sets up what the rationale for what the bank is now doing in this space. I thought I'd start, well, let me tell you what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with a really exciting new program that the bank was asked to set up by the governments of Germany and the United States and a host of others. It's called the WeFi, the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative. And it was launched in Hamburg at the G20 summit last July, and it will actually become operational this October. This is a facility. It's called the Financial Intermediary Facility, so the mechanics of that is less important. The most important thing is that 13 governments around the world, very diverse, US, Canada, Norway, Denmark, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Canada, South Korea, Japan, have come together collectively pledging more than $325 million in grant finance that we will collectively work to leveraging to more than 1 billion. So the idea is to use this 300 million and to mobilize 800 million more in financing for female-owned or led SMEs. And this is a really important moment for this type of facility. It's the first of its kind, and it's rather unique in what it does. First of all, it's unique because its scale, its scope, its ambition. There's a lot of other smaller funds that are out there, but this is actually much bigger, and it brings it together. It's unique because it recognizes that for female entrepreneurs, like male entrepreneurs, but particularly for female entrepreneurs to succeed, you need an ecosystem approach. There's not a one-size-fits-all or one type of intervention only. And we know this from the impact evaluation literature. Approaches to support women, as our colleagues have said, must be multidimensional. They must target the access to finance gap. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to give you a little bit of context on that. As our colleagues have said, access to finance is really a central constraint to women's entrepreneurship. And as Kristalina has said, women-owned formal small and medium business owners face a $300 billion annual credit deficit. Now, the credit gap for male-owned enterprises, small and medium enterprises in MENA, is about $244 billion and about $50 billion for female entrepreneurs. But let's also set this in context, because in MENA, women only own about 14% of formal registered SMEs, compared with much higher rates of entrepreneurship in the neighborhood of 40% in other regions like ECA and Latin America. Now, there are very many differences in this credit deficit. The IFC, our colleagues, have done some surveying, and the most recent survey in 2014 found that in the MENA region, 3/4 of the women business owners who were surveyed had sought external financing for their businesses sometime during the previous 12 months, so that was in 2013. 76% in Tunisia, 62% in the UAE, 59% in Jordan, but most did not receive any financing from a formal financial institution. I think that's something that we need to look at, and that's what this WeFi will talk about that in a minute. 55% of women business owners in Tunisia encountered an obstacle when seeking financing. For some, it was high interest rates. For others, it was the lack of collateral. So these are constraints that we need to, first of all, understand, but then we also need to target them. And they might face other constraints, like finding the process too complicated or being denied credit because of lack of a track record. There's also the type of financing. I'm talking about formal credit, but it's much harder for female entrepreneurs to find equity capital in addition to debt capital. So the importance of equity financing, particularly for the growth-oriented, the entrepreneurs that want to create jobs, is particularly important. And then on the other side, financial institutions, credit officers, sometimes, or not sometimes, frequently perceive women to be riskier, higher cost, and low return clients. And this negatively influences their appetite to women, regardless of whether the perception of higher risk is actually based on facts. We did an analysis of more than 2,200 enterprises that received SME finance from 34 IFC clients in 25 countries. And we found that female-owned SME clients were very often very well performing. They were up on their repayment rates, they had lower default rates, and they were the most overlooked market segments. So I actually think we have work to do among credit institutions, whether it's banks or other financial institutions, to change attitudes and perceptions about female-owned firms. Now, the financing constraint is only one constraint. There are other constraints that were mentioned in terms of capacity, mentoring, training. I want to mention two things that I think are important. One of the things that we know about female-owned firms, and this is true in MENA, is that they are they do have lower profitability than male-owned firms. Now, it's not because they're less efficient or they're less qualified as business owners, but sometimes it's because of the markets that they're in. They're in industries or occupations that are lower return occupations. And we're now starting to do some work to try to help women cross over into male-dominated sectors, which are higher return, higher value added for women themselves, and learning about what works to help women cross over. Of course, we have to work on enhancing the productivity and skill levels in the sectors that females traditionally have dominated. And as Hafez and Kristalina have said, there are legal and policy barriers. So this new WeFi, as we like to call it, is targeting these types of constraints. But as I mentioned, we're targeting them in a multidimensional way. The proposals that the multilateral development banks will be asked to present to the WeFi for this $300+ million in financing have to show an aligned public-private approach. In other words, understanding the regulatory and policy environment that exists, not just for SMEs, but whether there are special barriers that women-owned SMEs face. They have to show an understanding of the state of commercial finance or non-financial businesses. They have to look at where women are in the value chain of different sectors, as was suggested. So there has to be an aligned public-private approach, and approaches need to be multidimensional. And they have to be evidence-based, based on impact evaluation of what we know actually works for female entrepreneurship. And one of the things that we know about what works is it can't be business as usual and access to finance. So we're targeting SMEs. That means we need right-size finance. We need the right size of loans. We need to work around the collateral constraints. And we've done a lot of experimentation in different places about credit scoring, use of psychometric testing to help banks understand how they can better target this market. It's also not training as usual. You mentioned soft skills. There's a lot of work that we've been doing in countries like Togo and Malawi to show that personal initiative training is actually a much stronger determinant of female business owner success than standard business training, like how to manage your inventories and look at sales. So this is really important for female entrepreneurs. And then finally, this new facility is going to be targeting innovation and learning. We have to have a learning agenda. We have to have a data agenda. We don't actually know a lot about female SMEs. And in MENA, this is a particularly data deficit or a data scarce region. We really need to have public sector and private sector collaboration to be able to understand what the universe of female SMEs are, what their performance is, what their growth trajectories are, and more importantly, how they're contributing to their economies. So I think in conclusion, we have great hopes for this new facility to bring together everything that we've learned, to be much more ambitious, to get to scale, and ultimately to really make a difference for women SMEs on the ground for their communities.
Thank you so much, Caren.